We're live.
It's Thursday, May 28th on In Lieu of Fun, and we've kind of put a halt on the Criminal Justice Week for breaking news in coming out of the White House with the executive order signed by Trump that just, I think about 45 minutes ago, in fact, that basically stated that it was like, what was the final text of it? Was this social media bias, or what was it, Quinta? Do you know what the final title of the
we don't have the final text? Yeah, and I don't believe we have a final title, though it may have popped up by now.
Yeah, Preventing Online Censorship was the final title. I just looked it up. And we've spent, I think a bunch of us have spent the day following this out. Last night around 11 o'clock p.m. Eastern time, I got an anonymous email that was a draft of this executive order in my inbox, which I then also had forwarded to me by a number of other people who had gotten it from other known sources. It seemed to all of a sudden be circulating. And I verified it with someone in the administration, and then I posted it online with a brief summary on Twitter. And basically, what?
You broke the news.
Yeah, I mean, it just was like the first to put something that was going to happen anyways up on the thing. But anyways, thank you. Yes, I broke the news.
All of us were watching. Kate broke the news. Okay, like, you know, she's being all modest and shit. But
okay, anyways,
scoop here on Kate's Twitter feed, and she even texted it to me, but I was already asleep, so I didn't see it till I woke up this morning.
Yeah, so then I did a really fun 1:30 a.m. call, half asleep, at the New York Times, and then I stayed up till 3 because I couldn't fall asleep because I was trying to figure out what the heck this thing was and how much to really worry about it. And then all of the smart people woke up in the morning and helped me figure it out. And I think that there has been a lot of really interesting kind of back and forth. Eugene, we're here today with Eugene Volokh of UCLA Law School, the famous First Amendment scholar, the founder of Volokh conspiracy, and who has written frequently on Section 230 immunity, although not for a while, and is diligently follows the doctrine on this. And Jack Balkin of Yale Law School, who's the second time on the show, and who taught me everything I know about Section 230 until last night, when I had to teach it to myself, and the First Amendment. And Quinta Dresick, who was the managing editor of Lawfare and follows pretty much everything coming out of the administration more than anyone I know. And I don't know how you manage it and still smile. Although, Quinta, smile. You see it?
Yeah, I'm not in a smiley mood today.
I know. No. Well, who is these days? But
we actually have a smile joke where sometimes I will just look at Quinta and go like this.
Yeah, exactly. You're not really supposed to tell people to smile anymore, but in lieu of fun, we also have suspended the no telling people to smile rule.
Here's a rule we have suspended. The rule that we have to say, you're not allowed to have fun anymore. But in lieu of fun, we have Eugene Volokh, Jack Balkin, and Quinta Dresick to talk about the president's new executive order, the text of which is not available, the draft text of which Kate Klonick posted last night on retaliating against Twitter for fact checking the president, right?
Yeah. And so basically the whole text, my understanding of it, and I'm really looking forward to everyone else's take, because I think I've seen a few hot takes going around. My main take was like, I got a lot of questions from journalists today that were like, what is this? What is this for? Like, what is the purpose of this? And I was like, well, there's two purposes. There's the textual purpose of what this is supposed to be about. And then which is not going to work out very well for the administration, likely. And then there's the political purpose, which is really that this is a pandering to a base, maybe, and trying to have kind of to appease a lot of people who have been claiming bias in social media against conservatives.
I want to say I don't think that's the actual purpose. I think the actual purpose is playing the refs, is basically causing problems for social media companies, causing them to spend an enormous amount of time, worry, and attorney's fees to worry about this, even though they know that it's meritless and baseless.
This is so
don't
great.
politicians always have lots of purposes?
Maybe we should
Indeed.
Go
And actually, you know,
and
Eugene,
say what you think the purpose here.
at the risk of hijacking the agenda.
No, hijack it, Jack. Just let's talk about the purpose of this. Everyone says what they think the purpose is.
You yourself have written about the problem of politicians making veiled or overt threats against private actors, not through laws, which would be subject to First Amendment scrutiny, but sort of indirectly, jawboning and things like this. This seems to follow in this category. It's not a direct threat in the same sense, but it seems to be similar in the same family as things you've written about before.
Eugene, what do you think?
Well, you know, I'm sure that there is some element of that to this, just as I think Senator Biden had a statement in an interview talking about how Section 230 needs to be rolled back in various ways. People pay attention to that. At the same time, of all of the entities to intimidate, it seems to me that Twitter, Google, and Facebook are harder than some, especially since they're aware, at least at this point, and it doesn't seem likely to change after the 2020 election, that the House is not in Republican hands. And I think they can predict what the FCC and such will do with this just as well as we can, which is to say that the FCC is unlikely to roll back Section 230 in any meaningful way. So I'm sure that there's some element of that, some element of pushback, like you're mean to me, I'll be mean to you. Perfectly plausible. My suspicion, stripping it of kind of prejudging, like pandering and appeasing, my suspicion is that this is also a way of signaling to people who feel rightly or wrongly that these large business corporations are contrary to their, are doing things contrary to their views, and that in fact are trying to suppress their views. Historically, it had often been the left that complains that way about large corporations. Now in some measure, it's the right. So it's signaling to them, yes, I feel your pain. I feel the same pain too. I would like to do something about it, whether or not he actually succeeds. And I'm sure there are other purposes as well. I remember just some journalist once said, when have you ever heard of a politician doing anything for only one reason? Many reasons. I will say that my guess is that Twitter's fact-checking President Trump's tweets probably played relatively little role in anything but perhaps the timing of this release. My understanding, and I think Kate can speak more about it than I do, is that it's a very similar thing had been floated sometime before. It looks pretty thoroughly checked in some respects. I don't think it's great, but it's not a slapdash effort of an afternoon. Presumably, it had been vetted in many ways in many entities in the administration. Again, there may have been a choice to release it now rather than earlier. But the bottom line is we know that President Trump and many on his side in the Republican Party have had concerns about what the platforms have been doing for quite a while. So it's unsurprising that this would happen quite apart from the fact checking, which of course this order doesn't purport to try to stop the fact checking, nor could it.
Yeah, Quinta?
Quinta, what do you think? What's your, with the proviso that we actually don't know what the final draft says, what's your understanding of the motive here and the animating feature behind it?
Yeah, I will be as blunt as possible. It's a distraction from the fact that 100,000 Americans have died from a pandemic, and many of those deaths would have been preventable had the administration stepped in and taken action sooner. You can trace that to a bunch of different things. I mean, I think the proximate cause is perhaps that, as both Eugene and Jack have said, the administration has kind of had this beef with Twitter for a long time. Issy Lepowski in Protocol just reported that her understanding from a source who spoke to her is that after Twitter fact-checked the president's false tweet on voting by mail, the White House was sort of pushed into order, with people saying, we have to do something and pulling this old EO off the shelf. But I would argue that the fact that the president was tweeting up a storm about the vote by mail issue and about these conspiracy theories about Joe Scarborough is part of a days-long Twitter tantrum that serves him well insofar as it distracts the press's attention and frankly our attention from the ongoing pandemic. And so it's a difficult thing to keep in mind, I think, because you need to both acknowledge the fact that this is potentially quite dire depending on what is in the order, even if it's just a bullying tactic and has no real immediate legal force, as Jack said. But at the same time, I do think that it's important to keep that context in mind, and that turning a fight with a social media platform into a sort of culture war issue is ground that the president is comfortable with. It's something that he's done time and again, and he clearly thinks that it works for him. Talking about his administration's continued failure to respond to the really dire situation going on across the country is not something he's comfortable with. And so in a way, this is kind of a return to his comfort zone.
Word, I think I totally buy that. I think he's super comfortable when he's got big, powerful media entities, or in this case, social media entities, oppressing him. Kate, I'm interested for your thoughts on it, and particularly your understanding of what the draft, at least the last draft that we saw, what it would do. Okay, well,
Eugene is completely correct. So, I mean, everyone has I agree with everything that was just said in varying degrees. Eugene was completely correct. I think that this was an EO that was dusted off the shelf. And I think Quinta said this too in June, from June last year, when I remember being asked to write something about it. And I was like, can we just wait the weekend and see if he actually does this thing? Cause I don't think it's going to happen. And sure enough, it didn't happen. So I was glad I didn't spend 7 hours writing something. But I think that this got it was, from my sources inside the administration, it was dusted off the shelf very quickly and picked up because of everything that Quinta said, because of things Eugene said. I think it might have also, and I think that it had something to do with the Freedom Watch case that was settled by the DC Circuit. James Grimmelman on Twitter kind of pushed back on that and was like, that wasn't a very robust case. It probably wasn't that big a deal, but I think it was just another brick in the wall, so to speak, although walls are not the right metaphor for this administration. And I just I think that there is the things that I don't think that, Jack, you said that you didn't agree with my purpose, but then I think that you said what I thought that the purpose was anyways, which is that it's just jawboning. There's no real legal authority behind this. This isn't changing this isn't going to change the liability structure for these platforms. The reason I was up so late was I was talking to people at Twitter and no one was freaking out about this. They are not going to pay any attention or be bullied by this. I mean, they've taken on the Chinese government in various capacities. They're kind of a little bit used to this type of, and Pakistan and Iran and all of these other places, they're ready to go to battle over this with Trump. And I think that the possible challenge to this is that they assert that it's some type of infringement of their First Amendment rights as platforms.
Well,
do you agree with that, Jack?
That's why I asked Eugene about his work, because he actually has written about this before, but he didn't want to take up the question. Another interesting player in this story, though, of course, is Mark Zuckerberg, who has decided that he would pile on against Twitter and saying, how dare you try to be the arbiter of what is true or false? And I've got news for him, which he already knows, because he's well aware of what his company does. Facebook is also the arbiter of truth with respect to a series of issues. Facebook also says that it will take down certain content which interferes with elections. They don't apply it to Trump, but in fact, they apply it to everybody else. In order to be able to do that, you have to know what's true and false. Similarly, Facebook has announced that it will, in fact, edit or not edit, but it will demote or sometimes take down materials that are false and lead to conspiracy theories about health in certain circumstances. In order to do that, you have to know what is true and what is false. So I think what's interesting to me is how Zuckerberg is playing things. I mean, there's what's for public consumption and what he's actually doing as a policy matter. I also assume that if for some reason Trump loses the election and the Democrats take over, you will see Zuckerberg turn on a dime.
So we have people already putting in questions into the Q&A, and for those of you who are new to In Lieu of Fun, we don't take raised hands. If you want to pose a question, just flag it for us in the Q&A, and we will rapture you in to ask it.
Really quickly before we go to question, we can introduce Andrew, but then I really want to hear Eugene's response to Jack, just because it's right on point.
Yeah, so I want to do two things. First of all, I want to hear Eugene's response to Jack. But secondly, I want a good, clean summary of what the draft EO and what we assume the final EO, because it won't have changed that much over the course of the day, will actually do. So anybody who's, I don't know, Quinta, if you've really pored over that, or I know Kate has, but Eugene, the floor is yours. But then let's just have a really simple summary of what it is so that we're all actually talking off the same script here.
So I agree with Jack that Twitter, Facebook, and such do make judgments for what's false. One cost to all of them, regardless of the legal cost, is the more they do that in the more areas, the more they'll be pressured to do. So this, as I understand it, this thing about voting by mail being a breeding ground for fraud, it's actually a little unusual. This is an opinion. It's clearly an opinion, and it's a claim about what is likely to happen if we're going to have more vote by mail. Apparently, most experts that have considered this conclude that mail may lead to some extra fraud, but not much. More vote by mail. But it's an interesting question. Just once Twitter starts fact-checking those kinds of things, then virtually every claim, well, this will increase the deficit, this will decrease the deficit, this will lead to more crime, this will lead to less crime, might be something they're sort of pressured to do, may not be that much in their overall interest to be in a particular constant lightning rod that way. But second, I wanted to ask people in general a question, we can answer it now or later. What about Citizens United? I actually think Citizens United was right. I think that corporations, including business corporations, including entities such as Citizens United itself, which was in the business of making videos, but did not fit within the fairly narrow media exception to campaign finance law, they should have every right to talk about candidates, just like other entities. Likewise with unions, Citizens United struck down restrictions on corporate and union speech. But there is, of course, a common objection to especially corporate speech is that you have these behemoths, GM and various other entities, which as it happens don't spend a lot of money on campaign-related stuff, but some, playing this outsized role in public debate and trying to dominate elections or unfairly influence elections this way. So one question I'm curious about is, for people who are fans of Citizens United, fans of the Citizens United dissent, fans of this critique of Citizens United, what do you think about Twitter and Facebook having potentially this very substantial role in potentially swaying elections? One possible answer is that's awful because they're corporations or because they're wealthier or both. Another answer is that's just fine because corporations should be able to speak just as anybody else. Another answer might be, well, there's a special kind of corporation because they're kind of media-y, and the First Amendment treats Twitter better than it would treat GM and better than Citizens United, which was after all in the business of trying to make movies, albeit with some corporate funds. So I'm just curious what people, another possibility is, this is just a unfortunate necessity. Normally we'd be against them doing it, but it's such an emergency to try to constrain President Trump that it's okay for them to do it. I'm just curious what critics of Citizens United think about this influence of these large, super large, powerful business corporations.
Speaking for myself, I have never been a particular critic of Citizens United. And I've always thought that the critics of, as a former employee of the Washington Post, who wrote editorials that endorsed candidates and opposed candidates, I always thought that was our free speech right. And so I've always had an ambiguous relationship with Citizens United because I actually worked for a corporation that wrote editorials, and sometimes I wrote them, that, were relied on the idea that we as a corporation had the right to engage in political speech. And so I suspect I'm the wrong person to direct that question to, not because I'm sure that Citizens United is right, but because I'm not at all sure that it's wrong.
I mean, I think we should get into this after Andrew's question, but I think Andrew's question is also excellent. Andrew, do you want to?
Before we go to Andrew's question, I still want a good, simple summary of what the EO would actually do.
Yeah. Quinta, do you want to do
I can tell
it?
you a little bit about it, but you can correct
defer to
me.
Jack.
Yeah, go ahead, Jack.
Section 1, blah, 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 blah. Free speech important, free speech good. Right. Section 2, a tendentious interpretation of Section 230 that essentially claims that to the extent that Facebook adds content or edits content in any way to a post, it is outside of Section 230C2, which holds computer interactive service providers harmless if they remove content. It's a tendentious argument that if you make any change whatsoever or you add anything, that you're outside of Section 230. The courts have rejected this for a very long time. Eugene knows this law backwards and forwards, and he can give me chapter and verse on it. The second part of the section says, what we're going to do is I, the president, am going to request the Secretary of Commerce to file a petition in front of the FCC, requesting that they propose regulations to implement Section 230, which will be consistent with my purposes announced in Section 2A. I think there's also some mention of the FTC later on. You'll have to remind me.
There is. Yeah. They say that there's no federal dollars can go to marketing and advertising.
Yeah.
On any platforms that violate this new provision, this new interpretation of Section 230.
And then let's see, at the end of it, there's a request for state review of unfair deceptive practices to basically get the states involved. And then there's sort of more boilerplate. Puzzling is the question of whether the FCC, in fact, would have the authority to issue regulations in the interpretation of Section 230. Very puzzling to me. You can correct me if I'm wrong, Ben, you know more about these things than I do, but I don't recall the FTC having rulemaking authority. I thought that the FTC mostly issues orders and investigations, so also very puzzling. Also, since these are independent federal agencies, the president can't in fact require them to issue particular rules, even if they had the authority to issue the rules. So all of this seems sort of like mumbling to me. It doesn't simply make much sense. And as for the new interpretation of Section 230, here I'll throw it over to Eugene. It's highly tendentious. It doesn't seem to have any basis in existing case law.
Yeah,
Yes.
I also just want to say that Eugene brought this up in a cyberprofs listserv, which is like a big listserv of like all of us who do cyber law. And there were like 60 back and forth responses between people who did telecom law and really had a great in-depth conversation. I was so grateful for it. So Eugene, I'm really interested to hear what you took away from all of that.
Sure. Yes, I much enjoyed the conversation, people's feedback. So there are two questions with regard to Section 230 issue. One is, does the FCC have the authority to enact regulations as to Section 230? And I think the dominant view, albeit of course, as with most academic gatherings, of a particular slice of people who have particular preconceptions, political preconceptions, but the dominant view, which I expect is right, is that in fact the FCC likely does not have the authority to issue such regulations, although my sense was that it wasn't open and shut, that there was some ambiguity. And I think in general, it's legitimate for government officials to push the envelope in trying to push interpretations of the law that are not the standard interpretation, especially when they're not doing it by threatening people with prison for something that everybody thought was okay. But just say, I'm going to tell the Secretary of Commerce to ask the FCC to enact these regulations. FCC is perfectly free to say we don't have that power. But I do think predictively, highly unlikely anything will happen. Second question is, even if FCC has the power to enact these regulations, are they consistent with the text of the statute? And I think that they wouldn't be. I think that it's quite common to hear people say, well, once service providers start selecting what it is that they're going to include and what they'll take down, they lose the immunity provided by Section 230 because they become essentially publishers rather than mere platforms. Except that is exactly the view was taken by a decision, by a court case in 1995, the Stratton-Oakmont v. Prodigy case. That's exactly the view that Section 230 was aimed at overturning. Because the Congress in 1996, when it enacted Section 230 alongside the rest of the Communications Decency Act, actually wanted to see service providers do more filtering of sexually themed material and various other things. And as a result, it essentially said, look, you are entitled to this immunity, whether or not you filter. That's not exactly what it said, but I do think that's what it essentially said.
Pretty close to exactly.
Congress enacting a new statute saying, no, we changed our minds. We actually want platforms to be like common carriers, like the phone company. Then there would be an interesting question whether that's consistent with the First Amendment. There's actually some uncertainty in the Supreme Court case law on that. Or alternatively, you can get this immunity if you are a common carrier, like the phone company, open to everybody else. But if you choose to remove certain material, then you lose that immunity. You can imagine Congress enacting that. And again, then the question is, does it violate the First Amendment rights of the platforms? It's just not the statute as it was enacted and has been understood for 25 years, basically, by courts.
But does the president have any authority to just weigh in on a federal law and say, this is my interpretation of it, and throw out 25 years of judicial interpretation?
Well, I should think that the president would have the authority to say, I'm going to ask for FCC rulemaking. I can't order FCC rulemaking. I can't tell the FCC they must do this, but I'm going to ask my subordinates to do their darndest to try to enact this. It's kind of like if the president were to tell the Justice Department, we want you to challenge this statute. Courts have said that it's okay, that the statute is okay, or actually have interpreted the statute one way, but we'd like you to push this interpretation. It seems to me that that is really one thing that people in the political branches, such as the president, are entitled to do, even though it may be that they'll ultimately lose. The courts will say, nope, liked our interpretation better the first time.
So just to footstomp Eugene's point, it's been a few years since I really looked at the history of 230's interpretations in the court. But, there is a lot of case law in almost all the circuits saying that, the sort of Good Samaritan provisions, if you exclude stuff, it does not, abnegate your immunity. The one case I can think of that goes the other way is a case involving roommates.com in the Ninth Circuit, where roommates.com, which pairs people for roommates, actually had drop-down menus where you could say, you could choose the race of your roommate. I want a white female at, between the following ages. And some of those implicated protected classes. And the Ninth Circuit said, well, gosh, if you're organizing the discrimination on the basis of protected classes, that is an editorial addition that the service is making that is not simply passively carrying the participation of third parties. You're actually materially contributing to it. And so I think what the president could probably do based on, just again, I'm sort of talking out of my ass here, but may be able to do based on Ninth Circuit precedent is say, Twitter, in my view, is not immune for its own addition to the content. So it put that asterisk there that linked to content. That is Twitter's content, right?
And what follows from that?
I think nothing, because there's nothing libelous or actionable.
Well, but I mean, the point is that 230 says that you are not the publisher of someone else's content. Nothing in 230 says that you're not the publisher of your own content.
Exactly. So I don't think so.
I just say, Ben, the thing that's puzzling about it, most puzzling about it is this. Think about up the stack and down the stack. Up the stack, the curators, the search engines, the websites, all those. Down the stack, basic internet services, the domain name system, the broadband providers. The position of conservative Republicans, and not just conservative Republicans, but many folks, has been that as we go down the stack in broadband companies, you can't require neutrality. You can't require non-discrimination, right? They have a First Amendment right to do so. That's why network neutrality rules are unconstitutional from the standpoint of these arguments. Why in the world, when you go up the stack to the place where people actually engage in moderation, content moderation, that suddenly that's off the table? And if anything, it should be the other way around. Content moderation should be allowed up the stack at the curator level. And the plausible argument, not necessarily the winner, is that at the bottom of the stack for the broadband, you should be able to have something like common carriage or Title II. But whether or not you agree with that position, it makes no sense to argue against network neutrality below the stack and the bottom of the stack and argue for network neutrality at the level of the curator. It's a puzzling claim for Trump to make.
Jack, it's not my view. I don't have a firm view on net neutrality, but my sense is that the argument for many is it's not good when super influential entities discriminate based on viewpoint of speech. Whatever one might say about the net neutrality debate, I don't recall any specific instances where let's say, Comcast said, "Oh, we just want to not."
Sure, it did. There was throttling and like other types of things.
Right. But the throttling was not based on viewpoints.
There were text messages about abortion that were filtered out at one point. But the point is that under the Supreme Court's precedent, viewpoint and content, both viewpoint and content-based regulation, are subject to strict scrutiny. That's Justice Thomas. So the question is not about whether it's viewpoint discrimination, but whether it's content discrimination.
All right. So
hold on 1 second. I have
two different
breaking
questions
news.
here. Pardon?
Why breaking news? Just that we have the executive order that is final. It's in the chat for everyone to look at. Thank you to John Bordeaux for finding it and posting it. John is a loyal viewer and it's always wonderful. So thank you so much.
4 episodes of In Lieu of Fun that I think anyone else except Pauline. And, these are the heroes of In Lieu of Fun. And so just want to shout out to them both.
Yeah.
Also Big Blue Blogger and Kevin R, of course. So Kate, is the final version materially different from the version we just discussed?
I literally haven't looked at it yet. I just wanted to put it's I posted it to all the panelists and attendees. People can go look at it now while we take and switch over. I didn't want to cut Eugene off. I want to hear this. I think that this is such an important conversation about the stack and viewpoint discrimination. But I do think Andrew has a very good question. He's been patiently waiting here. So just go ahead, Andrew. What's your question? Sorry for making you wait so long.
Hey, no problem. I'm just a fly on the wall here. So my question, very, very quick. So it seems like this was definitely a restless move, and there's more than one way I think that this could backfire against the president, short of him winning or losing the election, because I don't think this would make the difference. But I'd just like to hear thoughts on plausible ways that this could backfire against the president.
Really interesting. Quinta, what do you think about that? So you're other than perhaps me, our resident Trump watcher, do you think this kind of distraction, look over here, Twitter is evil, I'm fighting for you on social media, does it have any legs in the community that he's trying to address, or is this something that is likely to backfire? And if so, how do you think it backfires?
I mean, it'll find support among his base because everything he does finds support among his base, right? That's like saying the sky is blue. I don't think that's a real. It doesn't mean anything one way or another. I have no sense of whether, if we're speaking in terms of electoral politics, if this changes things one way or the other. I expect it doesn't, because it's one of 500 different crazy things. And by the time that people actually start thinking about voting, will be completely forgotten. I do think one take I saw that was interesting, and I'm going to apologize here. There's a Politico writer who made this point, whose name I have completely forgotten, but it was her point, it's not mine, that Trump has been sort of jawboning about hitting back at Twitter like this for a while. And given that the order itself seems to be so functionally toothless, there may be a kind of, that's it vibe from Twitter that, you took your shot and that's the best you got. And it's actually not very much. And so perhaps if you're Twitter, you look at this and you make the calculation that, we can deal, and you don't back down in terms of fact checking the president's tweets. I can't imagine if this is the order that they released after a year of sitting on it, I have to say I'm having difficulty coming up with what else they could have drafted that would be harsher, that wouldn't just, I suppose they could just go all out and declare war on the First Amendment if they wanted, but that strikes me as unlikely for a variety of reasons.
We're talking about frivolous claims. Why not sic the antitrust division on?
Sure. Yeah,
sic the FTC for deceptive trade practices. There's, if you're the president, you have no scruples, you have no shame.
No, but hang on a second, Jack. There is a countervailing. This is not picking a fight with Joe Scarborough over whether he murdered somebody. And just for the record, Joe Scarborough didn't murder the staffer, and the president shouldn't be tormenting her husband. But this is a powerful entity with essentially infinite litigating capacity, much as his own Justice Department has.
Oh, I forgot. I didn't know which entity you were referring to.
No, I'm talking about Twitter, right? So Twitter is, not the most powerful of the social media entities, but it certainly has the ability to bring a suit. The law appears, by all of your accounts, the law appears to be on its side on a variety of matters. And so you could imagine this backfiring in the sense of Twitter getting an injunction that would be somewhat embarrassing, right? And so I guess my question is,
an injunction for what?
Right. The problem is that the order doesn't do it enough to warrant injunctive relief, right?
How would the injunction prevent the DOJ from starting to noodle around on antitrust issues or deceptive practices issues? Would you get an injunction against the DOJ ever bringing a lawsuit?
I don't think it does. I don't think that there's any way that this is legally robust enough to have any type of blowback for Trump directly. But to piggyback on Quinta's point, which is basically that also the sky is blue, his base is going to be his base. Nothing can stop that. What I think might happen here and is interesting is there's a lot of movement on the left that has been anti-platform, anti-tech, tech-lash for the last 5 years. And what you'll have now possibly is that the enemy of my enemy is my friend, and that basically Trump waging war on the tech companies drives the left, who have been pushing for antitrust movement on the tech companies, right into the arms of the progressive left. And you're all of a sudden going to have kind of they don't want it, they stand up for the tech companies because they're being bullied by Trump. And Jack is laughing, and I can't tell if he thinks that it's because I'm being ridiculous or very smart. Probably
maybe both.
Eugene is always right. A little bit of both. That in fact, there are some people who will be silly enough to think that all the critiques they made of these companies should somehow vanish because Trump is attacking them. That's just bizarre. But somebody might do it. Obviously, one thing it's going to do is that people like me, who I'm out of sort, who actually think these companies have First Amendment rights and therefore can raise First Amendment defenses to certain kinds of regulation, will rise to the defense of these companies, even though I also believe in other kinds of regulation with respect to them. But I don't know. We'll see what happens.
So I think the First Amendment question is actually very interesting. It has to do with tension between Miami Herald v. Tornillo and Turner Broadcasting. But I see Genevieve here is...
we just brought in Genevieve Lockyer, the inestimable University of Chicago law professor on the First Amendment.
It's our
Let's turn to her.
Well, I have a question. I'm just an audience. I was listening to you, Eugene. You were about to explain how to resolve the tension between Tornillo and Red Lion.
I don't know how to. No, but I'm sorry, not but Turner. So let me just go back a little bit. So first of all, to me, it's completely clear that Twitter has every right to condemn Trump's statements about vote by mail or post whatever it wants to there. That's indubitably their First Amendment right.
So wait a minute, let me clarify that for a moment. If Twitter wanted, instead of to put an asterisk on it and say, go to this CNN article and see what the facts are about vote by mail, if Twitter wanted to attach a big red watermark that said fucking bullshit to every tweet that Trump uttered. Trump can say whatever he wants, but we as Twitter, I as the all-powerful Jack Dorsey on this platform, want to watermark fucking bullshit on everything the president says. That's totally within their rights, right?
Of course it is. There's a reason they're not doing it. It's a public relations reason.
It's also it's a little crude, Ben.
but so I'm sorry if I could just, because I think that Jack identified, I think, a really important question, which is, let's say that we're not talking about just, as in fact the order isn't talking about just responses, but outright removal. And let's say Congress passes a law that says basically these platforms are common carriers. They're just a phone company. Phone company can't just cancel someone's service except for non-payment. They can't cancel service, certainly based on viewpoint. Likewise, these platforms, they can say whatever they want in their own speech, but they can't delete your account or block access to your account because of your viewpoint. So one possible response is that's a violation of the company's own First Amendment rights, because they have a First Amendment right to decide what to exclude from the platform. And the example is Miami Herald v. Tornillo, where the Supreme Court struck down a state right of reply statute, which required newspapers to publish replies to criticisms of candidates. And it said that violates their First Amendment right to decide what is to exclude and not just what to include in their newspaper. Another possibility, though, is it's kind of like must-carry requirements imposed on cable operators, not cable programmers, but cable operators. Cable companies like Time Warner and the like that have all of these channels, and it required them to carry broadcasters in some of those channels. And it did so in a content neutral way, or at least a way Supreme Court was found content neutral. There, the court, by a 5-4 vote to be sure, said that's fine because it's just a access requirement that doesn't really compel speech. So one question is, where would a requirement, purely hypothetical at this point, but requirement of a common carrier status, essentially, of viewpoint and content, perhaps neutrality by the services go? But then let me add one other question, which is, politically, I just don't think there's that much constituency for that. But I think there'd be even less constituency, given that that means that the platforms would have to be super duper neutral. They couldn't, for example, block pro-terrorist stuff, which I understand that many of them tried to do, and lots of people in both left and right are very happy about that. Any viewpoint neutrality and a content neutrality requirement imposed on platforms would itself have to be viewpoint and content neutral. So it may just be that's politically unavailable, because nobody would say, well, yes, indeed, Twitter can't go against ISIS enthusiasts. But I do think that, setting that aside, the question about the Miami Herald versus Turner Broadcasting, what's the best analogy, is actually an interesting and unresolved question.
It's a really, Genevieve, I really want to hear what you have to say.
I think it's a really interesting theoretical question for law professors. I think it's a predictive matter. It's pretty easy to think what court, specifically the court, will do. I mean, they're going to think this is Tornillo and not Turner. I think because in Turner, it is really interesting thinking about the line of cases in which the court allows the government to impose these kinds of speech facilitating duties on private actors. I'm actually writing about that line of cases right now. But one of the things that's
Where do you end that line of cases, Genevieve?
Turner. No, I mean, the DC Circuit's decision to uphold the net neutrality
Not Pruneyard?
I think is really interesting. Well, Pruneyard. But very recently, the DC Circuit said the net neutrality rules are fine over a very strong dissent by Kavanaugh,
Yes.
who thought even that case, which I think is actually much further away from the edge of the existing doctrine than the hypo Eugene suggests, because there isn't a lot of evidence that the ISPs were engaging in the kind of editorial decision-making that it's obvious that Facebook and Google and Twitter are engaging with. Even there, Kavanaugh, who of course now is on the Supreme Court, said this is too much of an intrusion on their expressive autonomy and their property rights.
Actually, let me just say that the way to understand these cases is to understand the role of the stack in digital communications. That if you're lower in the stack, you can be a common carrier. So the DC Circuit says we can analogize broadband companies because they're lower in the stack to common carriers, and that the FCC can call them common carriers. In fact, in Turner, the court said that we could in fact have had a system where the cable providers were common carriers. It would be a video dial tone system. We didn't choose it. We chose not to make them common carriers, but we could constitutionally have made them so if we had wanted to. The interesting question that Eugene is raising is this. In a world where we already have search engines and we already have social media companies, they're already fully formed organizations. So they're not like telegraph companies and broadband companies and such, right? Can we then retroactively make them common carriers? In other words, can we insist that they change their business fundamentally so that they are no longer curators and organizers of public discourse, but now to be common carriers? Or could we say that they have to sever their content moderation services off and make a separate company, and that the message delivery system of these companies should be treated as a common carrier? These are very interesting and unsolved questions right now in First Amendment law.
Oh, Genevieve left. Bummer. Yeah, but to that point, I really like.
So
go ahead, Ben.
Who has a question that really suggests that he's actually compared the final version to the penultimate version. So Roman, first of all, pose your question, but secondly, are there material differences between the version the president signed and others to the extent that you've done a side-by-side?
I'm still working through it, but yeah, one of the interesting things that I did notice is that the final version drops the invocation of the Holmesian marketplace of ideas, which it explicitly stated in the draft. It seems to still kind of invoke similar ideas that these are public spaces, but also attribute now that these aren't passive bulletin boards, they're active speaker. Twitter is an active speaker when it jumps into the conversation. So I'm still working through it, but I was just curious if you all had thoughts on why it might have dropped that language, whether it might have thought, whether the administration might have thought that language cut against them, or there's something else that would have motivated that.
Quinta?
Well, yeah, I mean, look, if you're talking about a marketplace of ideas, sorry.
Just a second. Ramon, super interesting question. And as you continue to go through it, if you notice other discrepancies, just flag them for us in the Q&A, and we'll bring you back in to keep us posted.
Sounds good.
Quinta, the floor is yours.
I was just going to say, look, I mean, Donald Trump's idea of contributing to the marketplace of ideas is to yell witch hunt and call people losers. So I don't think that if there is a genuine marketplace of ideas, it's hard to imagine that he would be the winner. So the fact that they took that out is amusing at the very least, although I don't believe that that is the reason why.
But that's the reality of all political movements, right? There are serious people and less serious. Some of the less serious ones can actually be very effective. Every movement is a mix of sloganeering and often vacuous rhetoric and substance. You know, I'm sure you find that in pretty much everything. There are powerful arguments for labor unions, and then there are inflatable rats hanging that are displayed or on the sidewalk outside of buildings. Is that much of a contribution to marketplace of ideas? Well, no, but even though the union movement has a lot to say in the marketplace of ideas. I don't think that's particularly special to the Trump administration, where I'm sure President Trump is well aware that there are other people working for him that do have more substantive arguments. He just doesn't seem to particularly care to make them himself.
That's the nicest thing I've heard about President Trump in a long time, Eugene.
Well, maybe we should get out a little more and have people who say nice things about President Trump. I'm the wrong one to say nice things about President Trump.
No.
But obviously enough people are. It would be nice to know, to hear from them.
No, absolutely. And I just spent a very pleasant hour with Eli Lake talking about the Flynn case. So I do go out of my way to do these things. But I actually think that's a really interesting point, that that in every political movement, there are the sort of bomb throwers, and there are the intellectuals, and there are the decision makers, and Trump is the kind of a combination of a decision maker and a bomb thrower. But that doesn't mean that there are not intellectual arguments behind the positions that he is advancing in a decidedly non-intellectual fashion.
I mean, can I just say the text of the finalized executive order specifically expresses irritation with the fact that Twitter did not fact check a tweet that Adam Schiff wrote about the, and I quote, Russian collusion hoax. So I would love to hear what the detailed, thoughtful exegesis of the intellectual generation of that part of the order would be.
I will say this about the conservative bias, claim, which having just studied the platforms for this long, and I've talked to a lot of people who have been at the companies since like 2004, 2008, 2000, right? And working on kind of these things. And they're like, the rules have not changed that much or moved that much. Like what was extremist speech in 2004 is pretty much still extremist speech now. What has changed, they say, is the amount the amount of extremist speech that is being spoken and who is speaking it. And so whereas before the speech had been fringe, it is now kind of it has become more mainstream, and so it gets flagged so much more. And so it's not as if they've drafted these per se ahead of time with this mens rea of bias towards conservatives, but it was rather at the time a bias towards trolls or terrorists or white nationalists or what have you, and that speech has been co-opted by the right in this way and become more mainstream. And so it's almost like a coming, not to go back to my property roots, but a coming to the nuisance problem. It's they have the causality slightly reversed. It's not that they're wrong, maybe their speech is being disproportionately taken down, but there isn't that's not something that's happening. That's not something that's happening because they're conservative or because anything else. It's because of the literal type of speech that they're invoking.
So let's pause a moment over that, because I think that's a really that's the sort of tectonic layer of this conversation, which is there any merit to the conservative suspicion that these rules are being applied in a way that even if they are sort of facially neutral, they are being used in a fashion that discriminates against conservative speech, and they're being used weaponized in some sense. I have this instinctive sense that there is essentially no merit to this contention, but I'm interested in whether that's wrong. Do any of you think that there is, leaving aside whether Twitter has the right to discriminate against conservative speech, which it certainly does, is it doing it?
Well, I mean, I would also say to completely sorry, I have a little fly in my face. To completely destroy my own point, it's almost basically in some aspects, what they're basically claiming is a disparate impact claim, which is that there was no particular mens rea, but that no matter what, even the facially neutral policy disparately impacts certain types of people.
But a disparate impact claim doesn't move me at all, because a disparate impact claim here means if you're saying hate speech has no place on Twitter and conservatives are disproportionately impacted by that because they're disproportionately engaged in hate speech. Well, oh well, maybe conservatives should should do a little less hate speech. On the other hand, if your interpretation of hate speech is such that it envelops a whole lot of conservative speech that a neutral principle would not identify as hate speech, that's a very different matter. And I've never seen any evidence that there's a sort of cultural bias in the way that the Silicon Valley firms are interpreting these ideas and terms. On the other hand, look, they are in frickin' Silicon Valley in the Bay Area. It's like the height of coastal elites. And so if somebody wants to argue that, like, you know, that there's a implicit cultural bias and political bias in the way that they're interpreting their own terms, I'm not necessarily averse to that. I just haven't seen any evidence of it. And so I'm curious whether any of you guys know to what extent there may be, it has been studied, and to what extent there may be merit to the claims that conservatives are making about Twitter and, for that matter, Facebook and Google.
I want to say that I find this entire discussion too American-centric. These are global companies. They try to apply relatively the same standards around the globe to the extent they can. They can't always. And most of the decisions are not being made by Americans. Most of the decisions are being made by people in airplane hangars that are not well conditioned, air conditioned, and are given large, lists of PowerPoint decks and making decisions every 3 seconds. And so this is an accusation against what is essentially an industrial process. An industrial process which is organized around global norms and global standards as opposed to the standards of Silicon Valley. And I could well understand why American conservatives would feel that this particular industrial method of production of content moderation has a disparate impact on them and is insensitive to their needs. I could well understand why they would say that. The question is whether or not that's what you think about that. That is to say, this might be the moment in which they might find that industrialism is a bad thing, and that economic efficiency is a bad thing, and that the discipline of the market is a bad thing, because of course it's these features that have led to these forms of content moderation. Twitter and Facebook could have invested a lot more in content moderation, and they might be much more sensitive and good at it than they currently are. So that could be part of the problem.
I had two thoughts which are not inconsistent with what Jack was saying. One, just to give you an example, it's the only one I happen to know off the top of my head, but Twitter has this hateful conduct policy that, among other things, prohibits, quote, targeted misgendering of transgender individuals. Now, some people believe that, in fact, not just some, probably a very substantial portion of the population, maybe a majority, maybe a substantial minority, believe that, in fact, somebody can call themselves something other than their anatomical gender, setting aside people for whom the anatomical gender is ambiguous. That doesn't make them that gender. And if somebody is born male and at least hasn't gone through a sex change operation, they're male. Other people believe the opposite. In fact, believe it's a horrible, hateful thing to say that, to call them male, you should call them female. I actually don't really know what the right answer is on this. I think the jury is probably still out on it. And certainly, if you look at our legal system certainly not taken the view throughout the country that, say, discrimination based on gender identity is improper, although many states have taken that view. And of course, this issue is before the Supreme Court. But in any case, I don't think this is properly labeled a matter of hate speech. This is something in which I think reasonable people can differ. And this is just an example of where Twitter has taken a view that is, I think, very much associated with the left rather than the right, and the mainstream left rather than the mainstream right. Just one example. But the broader point is, my guess is, I'm not sure, but my guess is that I am the most pro-Trump here, and I'm not pro-Trump. I didn't vote for President Trump. I don't much like the man. I certainly disapprove of many things that he has done, and I certainly disapprove of the way that he has done them. But presumably there are some people out there. My sense is there are some serious people who feel that they do have some evidence of this bias. I just happen not to be one of them, partly because that's not a field I study. So Ben, if you want to know, why don't you ask some other people other than us? Why don't you ask some people who really have done the research or claim to have done the research and see what their best shot is? I just don't think you're going to get the best argument from us on this.
Can I win?
No,
there has been no reporting.
One second, Quinta. That is totally fair. And Stuart Baker, who has both written for Volokh Conspiracy and written for Lawfare, wrote for us on this. And I have spoken to Stuart about it, and his view is that he feels in his gut that the bias is there, and he can cite anecdotal evidence of it, and he cannot cite compelling evidence of it. And so I take that as as sort of the best of the art, frankly, which is to say, I think Stuart cares about this issue a great deal. I think he wants to find it. I think he believes it's right. And I don't think he can quite put his finger on it. But I'm asking you guys because you guys are the ones who were here. But it is a subject that I've sought more input in than that. Quinta, sorry.
There has been a lot of reporting on this. There is no reporting that a viewpoint-based bias is occurring against, however you want to call it, right-leaning Americans, conservative Americans, is happening on social media platforms at any scale. It doesn't exist. Certainly, absence of evidence is not necessarily evidence of absence, but there isn't any evidence for that. And I do think that clearly this is something that people feel very strongly about, but I do think that is important to keep at the front of our minds. As Ben says, the best evidence there is for this claim is anecdata. I don't doubt that the people who experience that feel very strongly that their posts shouldn't have been marked or taken down or any of that. And I don't want to in any way cast aspersions on that, but a few anecdotes does not a pattern make when, as Jack says, we're working on the scale of nations here. And so it may well be that, who knows, right? Maybe that evidence will surface in a week from now. There's a lot of data these companies have that we don't have access to, and that's been a point of contention. But as we now stand, reporters have been digging into this for 5 years, and nothing has come up. So I just wanted to put that on the table.
I think that is completely correct. But all of this is anecdotal, and it's not just a conservative bias. It's every instance that this comes up. I feel like a goldfish swimming around in a goddamn bowl that keeps every 3 seconds oh, I'm here again. Huh. Forgot that I was here. And then goes around again. It just completely forgets. It's just all new. It feels like that with people's outrage. Fresh outrage every 3 months over some new content moderation scandal. And it's really there's a slow uptick in collective knowledge, I think, about this sphere and an education that's slowly happening to the public, but it is really slow. And as anyone who has ever done any content moderation work, be it for the New York Times, op-eds, be it for Wall Street Journal, comments on their op-eds, be it for any of the platforms, they'll tell you that most people do not get outraged until they themselves are censored. And that is really where they decide to draw the line. It's people just don't like having their shit taken down. And so they really won't, they just can't they can't give a care for anyone else. Anyways, but we have Tone.
I'm totally with that because, sometimes I have been known to out trolls and to be a little bit loose with their personal information when outing people who send me vile threats. And the idea that I am risking having my content taken down by sharing truly disgusting emails that are sent my way rankles me, and it rankles me more than much more serious abuses that involve other people.
Well, I guess you care about outcomes and not principles, Ben.
I do. Tone Glavinich, I do not know how to pronounce your name. Please accept my apologies for however I have butchered it. But you appear to have also actually compared the final version of the order to the draft. So please give us your thoughts and your question.
Yeah, so I only read a little bit of the first section so far, but one thing I thought was really strange was they took out direct references to companies. So instead of saying Google made a search engine for the Chinese Communist Party, now it says one American company made a search engine for the Chinese Communist Party. But it also added specific targeted statements about a couple of people, one being Adam Schiff for the tweets about the debunked Russia conspiracy, and then also specifically targeted a member of Twitter staff, their head of site integrity, because he's not by name.
Not by name.
Because alleging him for exhibiting political bias in his past tweets, which from what I've seen on Twitter seems to be 2 or 3 tweets from 2016, which I think is before he was in this role at Twitter. So I'm mostly curious, what sort of precedent is there for calling out individuals in executive orders? And I imagine there's no sort of recourse for that, although I expect that staffer has become the target of a whole bunch of Twitter dogpiling. He was also tagged by the president in a tweet earlier today.
That's a really interesting question. Does anybody know whether there is any history of calling out individuals in executive orders? I kind of can't imagine that there is, but I'm eager to be shown wrong about that. Does anybody know the history of this?
So there was a term, and I don't know how often it was used. I just read it in some novels a while back that apparently was used among the public school set in elite England, which was infra-dig, just beneath one's dignity. Then we do that because it's infra-dig. And the fact is that we have this set of standards of what is infra-dig, and apparently President Trump does not share them. So it would not shock me if nobody had ever done this in an executive order before, because it's an executive order. It's supposed to be for something serious and substantive, perfectly plausible. But it doesn't follow that there is any legal remedy or that there should be any legal remedy in this. President is entitled to fulminate about Representative Schiff, just like Representative Schiff is entitled to fulminate about the president. And if he could do a resolution in Congress, enact a statute, the Blame Trump Act, then it wouldn't be anything unconstitutional about that. Likewise,
wouldn't there be then there's a constitutional provision that you can make it a crime to be somebody.
Yeah, Bill of Attainder.
Yeah.
Of course you can make it a crime. He can't have an executive order saying we're going to execute Adam Schiff, but to say, I think Adam Schiff is a dirty liar is something he's perfectly free to do. More broadly,
he actually has a presidential privilege to do that.
Well, it's not just presidential privilege. I mean, I do think that even if it were libelous, maybe he might have an official privilege, but there's nothing, I think, that stops him, as no legal principle that says you can't name people by name or by position within a private corporation in an executive order. More broadly, I take it that this is, in a sense, an attempt to provide specific evidence, albeit in the form of anecdotes and quite possibly unpersuasive anecdotes. People might say, well, what evidence do you have that Twitter is placing labels in a discriminatory way? He says, well, my evidence is they didn't do it to Adam Schiff. Maybe it's unpersuasive evidence, but I take it that's what he's responding to. In any case, it does seem to me to be inconsistent with the norms we'd expect from the way that official business should be done. Welcome to the Trump administration, right? We've seen that for a long time. But it doesn't follow that every such inconsistency with norms has some legal barrier to it.
I agree with that. I think
I think the president is perfectly entitled to issue an executive order cursing out Adam Schiff. And the remedy against that is that we all judge him for it. And that we put an asterisk in our definition of what an executive order is, that this is what an executive order was, except in the Trump administration when it was also used to curse out senior members of the House opposition party.
I think what you're worried about, I think what you're worried about, Ben, is you're worried that it might not become an exception. You're worried if it was just this administration and no other before or since, you could deal with that.
Well, so I wrote a whole book about that exact point, that, and so I take it very, very seriously. But if the question is there some legal impediment to it? The answer is no. The answer is he is entirely entitled to try to reshape the presidency in that direction. And our only remedy is to resist it by ultimately political means. Kevin R., you have the last question.
Okay. And this ends up being sort of hypothetical, but if Trump actually gets what he seems to want, if he actually manages to push Twitter out of the 230 box and make it into something like a newspaper with the liability responsibilities that go with that, is that actually helpful to Trump and to, as was discussed previously, some of the conservatives with their harsher speech? Because if Twitter has to act like a newspaper and has to edit out the things that might get sued for, it seems like, well, that's the sort of thing which would make them suppress hate speech and defamatory statements against private individuals. I mean, the Joe Scarborough stuff will stay up because I think Falwell would give them enough protection for that. But it seems like there's a lot of, if Twitter started actually editing things and as if it had responsibility, they'd end up with a more liberal view. It wouldn't be favorable to the conservative arguments.
Why do we think that's what Trump, I'm sorry.
No, go ahead.
Why do we think that's what Trump wants? I think what he probably wants, to the extent that he wants something other than score political points, I think what the backers, let's just say what a thoughtful backer of this kind of order would want is to put Twitter to a choice. Either you edit, in which case you'll be subject either to the responsibility of a newspaper, which is quite broad, or a bookstore, which is more like notice and take down liability, where if somebody alerts it that something is libelous, let's say, then it needs to be taken down. Or alternatively, if you don't like that, and we're pretty sure you won't, then you need to operate as if you were a common carrier. You need to at least be viewpoint neutral, maybe even content neutral in your operation. Again, I'm not positive that really makes sense even to conservatives, but as to content neutrality or even viewpoint neutrality. But I think that's what this is trying to aim to. So they don't actually want Twitter to actually be liable. They want the concern about liability, if indeed the FCC enacts the regulations they're asking for, to pressure Twitter into being even-handed. Maybe they're already even-handed, but be more even-handed, let's say. Or at the very least, maybe not discriminate against purported extremists, left or right. And that, it seems to me, would be just fine for President Trump.
All right, we have got to wrap up. But I have to say that in the Q&A feed is the perfect last word for the day. So Ken Landa, the last word is yours today.
Well, I just couldn't help remark that Infradig would be a great book title for an account of this era.
I can't beat that.
I'll fight you for it.
So
Jack's already writing like 3 books. So what are you going to call it? Are you going to take one of those names?
Infradig 1, Infradig 2.
No, it'd be Infradig, then Superdig. Sorry. Yeah. Sorry.
It's a great title, and all I can say, Ben, is get to work.
Yeah, no, I'm so on that. Quinta Jurecic, Eugene Volokh, Jack Balkin. By the way, one point of personal privilege. Whenever somebody asks me what the major influences of lawfare were, I always name three people. And one is Eugene Volokh, one is Jack Balkin, and the other is Marty Lederman, and actually a fourth, the SCOTUS blog folks. But, you know, like to have two of you guys on who like so profoundly influence what we do on a day-to-day basis is actually a big kick. And I just, you know, I think it's you know, these are two of the godfathers of kind of what you think of as legal blogging. And I am, it's really neat thing to have you guys on in both individually and particularly collectively. And of course, Quinta is the inheritor of all of this. And so,
thank you for allowing me to crash the party.
You know, it's Quinta's all the way down, as they say. So thank you all for joining us. And we've already had the last word. So Kate, what do we say until tomorrow?
If you can't have fun, Jack is laughing because, okay, so here's a little story, is when I first started as a resident fellow at Yale ISP, I would like go to the ISP lunches and I would try to talk and I would just kind of like not fully formulate sentences. And I was really bad at talking. And I went into Jack's office hours. He's like, "You're not very good at talking. You need to get better at talking if you're going to be a professor." And that summer I went and did Toastmasters.
I told you.
And I actually like really
told
worked.
you to do, yeah.
And I really worked at like trying to get comfortable with like being a public speaking in my own voice, which is why I'm so shitty at like reciting things I haven't written or thought about. But in lieu of fun, if you can't have fun, come hang out with us. I still screwed it up.
You know,
bye guys. Thanks for coming on.
Thank you. Thanks very much.
Eventually she'll get it. Thank you all. See you tomorrow.
Bye guys.